Welcome everybody to today's webinar of reducing energy costs in irrigated sugarcane. Just so you all know, you are currently in audio only mode, so you won't be able to ask any questions. But on the right-hand side of your screen, you should see a little toolbar, and midway down that toolbar is a question panel. So if you have any questions at all during the webinar, you'll be able to type those in and we'll address all the questions at the end. So feel free to write as many questions as you'd like. We've got John Welsh and myself here from AgEcon, and we're presenting this work to you today from the SRA funded project. Over to you, John.
Thank you, Janine, and welcome everyone. This is our first year of a 3-year contract looking at solutions for reducing energy costs for irrigators. And in the abstract first slide there, you will see that just the 3 main points to come out of our first year study results. Pump sites under 40 kilowatts, so the smaller end of the irrigation. PV connections can offer high returns, and we will go into more detail of why that is over the next 20 to 25 minutes. The tariff scenario, 2 economists modelling out these alternatives over 25 years is difficult, given the connections. The tariff scenario with ergon is under review at the moment, and rural tariffs will change. So we'll preface our assumptions of how we got the results and go into some more detail there. The really large systems operating, for example, under centre pivots or laterals, what we found is we need high utilisation rates, and by that meaning we need to closely try and match energy demand with supply of renewable energy to provide good returns overall on a project scale. So the agenda for the next for this webinar: policy incentives for renewables. For those of you that watched Four Corners last night, this is very topical at the moment. That has been an interesting space for politicians to try and engage their constituents and to find the policy that fits all. Ergon connection rules, a bit about how important it is to understand what the options are when looking to substitute renewables or any other sort of generation into the mix. We'll also provide an overview of the components and technology that we've assessed as alternatives for irrigators before launching into the case study results so far on those 3 different locations. First of all, some background. The renewable energy target is Australia's key landmark carbon and energy policy on a federal government scale. A quick history lesson there. Basically, electricity is the largest source of emissions, and the renewable energy target is designed to address those emissions by providing incentives for renewables to come into our energy mix alongside coal and gas and more traditional sources of energy. And yeah, just a bit of a history there from 1997, the international commitments that our government bases their targets and goals on for their emissions commenced with Kyoto way back 20 years ago almost now, and flowing through to 2008, which was the Kevin Rudd change of government. He expanded the renewable energy target. That was tinkered with when Julia Gillard came to power, and then Tony Abbott in 2013 looked to completely throw that policy out, which created a lot of stalling of investments. And Malcolm Turnbull's leadership only 3 years ago did provide some more certainty, although the gigawatt hours target was reduced. And you can see there just the little chart on the bottom left of your screen. Australian Prime Ministers, there has been a very tight cluster of leaders over that 5 or 6 year period, where each leader has grappled within their own party, seeking to firm up the electorate and their prospects for coming elections. And there's been quite a lot of churn in leaders over that period, trying to get this energy policy debate right. And we still aren't really firm on where we're headed once the RET policy is reviewed again, and we have an election in 14 months, so or possibly sooner. But at the moment, things are very stable, and it's a really good time to take advantage of the RET. And if we just go on to the next slide, what does it mean for irrigators? Well, there's two components to the RET. The small-scale systems under 100 kilowatts of renewables, whether it be PV or wind, for example, they offer upfront installation incentives, directly, providing a rebate to your capital cost of your investment, which is very attractive. They say a bird in the hand. You know actually what you are going to get prior to your purchase, whereas large-scale systems is more of a floating claim. It's a market-based mechanism whereby once you've offset traditional energy sources, you claim back those large-scale certificates per annum. You can go out 5 years with brokers and claim those at a reduced rate, but certainly the upfront STCs are very attractive at the moment. That policy is winding down. Both the STCs and the LGCs are winding down. The deemable period for those rebates is reduced in January every calendar year. You'll see there by the chart, for example, a 100 kilowatt system at Mackay in today's terms will fetch around a $70,000 rebate for a 100 kilowatt install. And come January in 2019, that will be reduced by about $6,000, and that will continue to slide down as each year ticks on. So just combined with the increased competitiveness of solar in particular, that makes, combined with the rebate, that makes this investment alternative quite attractive at the moment, given we are in quite a stable period for policy, and it hasn't always been like that. Anyone in the solar industry will tell you how turbulent that has been to run a business or to manage this moving feast in renewable energy target policy. Ergon connection rules. Well, here's another something else we have to be abreast of. How we actually connect alternative energy sources is really largely determined by the transmission provider service rules and regulations. Each state is different. For regional Queensland, obviously you've got the Ergon rules, and we do have a tariff restructure, as I've already mentioned. Feed-in tariffs are varied within states as well. We do have some clarity now on the smaller end of the feed-in tariffs with a 10-cent incentive there to feed in renewable sources into the grid. And that does provide some certainty for those investments, being able to attract that feed-in tariff. And outside of that, there is a requirement to go through a fairly rigorous review process, depending on where your connection is and what the strength of the grid is in those areas. So connecting embedded generation behind the meter. Behind the meter basically means installing generation that's going to substitute grid-fed energy provided across large distances from coal-fired or gas-fired plants. You'll be substituting that grid power by renewable sources or even a diesel generator in some instances. So connecting these energy sources on three-phase systems on that smaller end scale under 38 kilowatts is quite simple from a regulation process, where inverters must not exceed 30 kilowatts. So a PV in that instance is normally 39.5 kilowatts. If you go greater than that, there are far more rules and studies to be done in that period, in that size range from 38 to 85 kilowatts, where there are fees for studies which the user is required to pay. So feed-in tariff eligibility must also be under 100 megawatts per year. Now, most irrigation pumps try to keep under that threshold so they don't attract the large demand tariff fixed costs. And a feed-in tariff discretion, from what the providers have been telling us, it's best to talk to those in your local area, but quite a few of the providers have been telling us, although it's discretionary, quite often the answer is no with with the feed-in tariffs outside of that 30 kilowatt export range. So one thing to bear in mind, the feed-in tariff policy can change. I mean, we only have had certainty one financial year ago, so a bit over 12 months ago, on the 10-cent feed-in tariff on the small scale, and this can change. And potentially, if that threshold reaches 100 kilowatts, well, the economics will change accordingly for the better. So the components under consideration for this SRA study, we have considered probably the most practical components for supply reasons. There is a large mechanical storage called a flywheel that has some positive results in international global literature on being complementary in these instances, but they're really only used in large-scale mining sector, so not really applicable. It's not something you can buy off the shelf, you know, in your local supplier's shop. So we have stuck to more traditional sources such as solar PV, lithium-ion batteries getting lots of press, obviously your grid power, wind turbines. Now, wind turbines are quite expensive to install, and there is a requirement for testing at whatever hub height you're intending to install at to have more certainty, because depending on whether it's deep in a valley or near a slope of a hill or with tree line, for example, or sheds nearby, the recommendation certainly is to test prior to installing a wind turbine. And they can require quite a bit of maintenance, which can necessitate a crane or other quite expensive maintenance. So we haven't gone into too much detail on the wind turbines for that reason, because of the unknowns. Then the diesel genset as well has been thrown into the mix of potential substitutes for grid power. So the SRA case studies, just some overview and background. The rationale has been 3 case studies per year for 3 years, looking at different applications of energy and irrigation. And in this first year, a big gun bore irrigator has featured, along with a pivot river irrigator up in the Mackay region there at Marion, and of course up near Ayr in the Burdekin, a furrow well irrigator there on a smaller scale. So the basic aim is to understand the feasibility and look at sensitivity of key variables to understand what's moving the models and the outcomes, and communicate general rules to irrigators. Over to you, Janine. Is that first screen there up and running for you?
Sure is, thanks John. So we'll start off with sugar. Located at Bundaberg, as John said, they had a bore, and the bore supplied the water to the big irrigators. So the 55 kilowatt motor on that pump is lifting the water a reasonable way, so it's taking a fair bit of energy per megalitre to lift that water. And important aspect of each site when you're considering a potential microgrid installation is the size of the transformer. Oh, so I'm getting a bit of repeat on my audio there. So when there's the 100 kVA transformer in this instance, wouldn't need any upgrades to look at a microgrid installation. So essentially for Bundaberg Sugar, their issue was price, and that was obviously for most people is a growing issue of the cost of energy. So energy security can be an issue on some sites. So for these solutions, we were essentially looking at bring price down and assuming a pretty good energy security on the grid connected sites. So all 3 sites were grid connected, and in this instance they all remained grid connected. We have heard people talking potentially looking at, do they unconnect from the grid, go back to diesel? And from our analysis, what we're looking at, saying keeping connected to the grid can give options, and you can have more options. You can throw in a diesel gen set if you need to, and at current price, that can be cheaper than some of the peak demand charges. But by staying connected to the grid, there are still options. There's the options of adding renewables and having the microgrid scenario where you can draw on various energy sources depending on cost effectiveness during different times of the day. With the Bundaberg Sugar, their cost of energy are on a But to run through these results, a 17.5% return on investment was a 5-year payback. For a 5.5-year payback on the investment, so it paid back quite quickly and reduced the cost of energy down to an average of 24.5 cents. So the idea of that was obviously using the solar during the day, and it's not a very big battery add-on there, so it's really just used to supplement the solar during cloud cover. One of the engineers that we spoke to suggested that because the battery pricing is still reasonable, it could be more cost effective and a simpler installation to instead of doing the batteries, put that money towards some extra solar, and you'll get some extra solar offset, which will also help in some cloud cover, but it would be probably more of a simpler install. So for the vicar's site, which was at Marion, he had a different scenario. His site was powering his pivot pumps, and as you can imagine, it's quite a large pivot there. He had a pretty large operating load of 157 kilowatts. So it was 3 different pumps, and he worked those for about 74 hours a week. So it's pretty important looking at your demand profile on your sites. So for him, being 74 hours a week, he was currently pumping to his tariffs and trying to get as much of his pumping done in the off-peak. So obviously, if he was to install some renewables or solar particularly, he would have the flexibility to be able to shift his energy usage into the day with the lot cheaper solar. Because as an indication, the solar is actually only about a 6 cent kilowatt per hour cost when you do that levelized over the 25 years. So it's a lot cheaper. So if you had a site where you were running 24 hours a day and you couldn't really shift it, you wouldn't see as much of a benefit as in Wayne Vickers' case, where he would be able to shift a lot of his usage into the day. It'd be a large site. It's just under the 100 megawatts. However, it can flow over the 100 megawatts, and by the installation, optimal results of 85 of 85 kilowatts, that would be over the threshold for a feed-in tariff. So anything over, as John mentioned, that 39 kilowatts of PV, there's no feed-in tariff for that. So the 85 kilowatts of solar was the optimal result, and that's at a cost of about $125,000. That also paid back within about the 5.5 years, and it reduced his energy costs down to about 20 cents per kilowatt hour. So we also ran the scenario of what happens if we limited the solar installation to under the 40 kilowatts and try and remain eligible for a feed-in tariff. And obviously, the solar wouldn't be able to offset as much energy because it's not producing as much. But because of the addition of a feed-in tariff, it was still quite an attractive option, and obviously it was a lot lower capital costs. However, it doesn't give as many options in terms of offsetting power, and one thing that we had considered is it looks like demand charges that potentially could be added in for sites. The threshold might lower from 100 kilowatts. So from 100 megawatts per annum. So it's important for him to keep that site out of demand charges, which could be much more expensive for him. The third and last site was the peroneus in Ayr. They had a lot smaller pumps. They were furrow irrigators, and they're just pulling their water out of quite a shallow well. So 2 smaller pumps operating often together, but they could be running separately. And they were generally running their 12-hour irrigation shifts at night. However, they've said, obviously, if they had some solar installation and it became cheaper, they would shift that into daylight hours to try and maximise the amount of grid energy that they could offset. So once again, it's pretty important to make sure you look at what your energy load profile would be if, in the case of having the solar, so we made sure we developed that properly. And they also said if they had cheaper power, they would potentially increase the amount of pumping they did from that particular site. So the site would be definitely eligible for the feed-in tariff of 10 cents because the 40 kilowatts of solar would easily cover that particular operating load. So they are also on tariff 66 at the moment, but obviously there's going to be the restructure in 2020, and the drought subsidies will possibly come and go. So we didn't model it on that particular tariff. We modelled it on 62, which is more likely to reflect the tariffs that will come in after 2020. So you could say it was fairly conservative the way we have modelled it. So the optimal result here was a 38 kilowatt solar installation, as well as the 30 kilowatt genset. So the solar is a little oversized for the site, but the idea here was to maximise the amount of energy that could be offset, and by oversizing the solar to the load, you actually increase the shoulder periods. So when the sun's coming up and the sun's setting, you're not getting your maximum output from your panels. The more panels you have, the more panels you have, the more energy that can be created and offset. So that was to essentially maximize the offset, and the 30 kilowatt generator, that is a diesel generator in this case, could then be used in periods of cloud cover or at nights also. So there's definitely a case for the diesel generators, and at current diesel prices it is cost effective to be used. And for them, the water security was very important. It's one of their key their water sources for irrigating, and it wasn't acceptable to be down for a couple of days during supply interruptions. So that was also the addition of the genset. Had the best payback at 4 years, largely as a result of the feed-in tariff. So that was a 22% return on investment, and their cost of energy dropped down to just over 15 cents. So we also took the generator out if water security wasn't or energy security wasn't a big issue. The cost of the genset taken out didn't change things a whole lot. So it was actually a similar payback, and the cost of energy at that 16 cents. So the generator is essentially added in for the energy security and ensuring water at all times on that site. But the biggest point really was that for the feed-in tariff and the oversized solar, it maximise the amount of income that could come back off that asset when they weren't irrigating. So, in summary, the solar is certainly the cheapest levelised cost of energy. And between that 5 to 7 cents, it is considerably lower than any grid delivered cost that you'd be getting. It's a lot lower currently than storage options and the wind as well. The small connections under, well, it's essentially under 40 kilowatts, a maximum of 39.5, the PV, they essentially are the best result because you can get your feed-in tariff while your investment is sitting there and you're not irrigating, so you can get your feed-in tariff and it can be making you money. So in any instance where the load can be shifted during to the day, so that the solar can be really maximised what you're using and offsetting. It's another big thing. And for the larger sites, particularly the sites over 100 megawatts per annum, the options are a bit limited. If you're a seasonal irrigator and you're using your sites or your pumps under 3 months a year, and in the other months you're not able to receive a feed-in tariff because of the large site classification, it's just you're not utilising the investment enough to make it pay back. So some of the options that we have seen for the larger sites is potential addition of a diesel generator, which could be used in if there was peak tariffs, or to bring the site to reclassify the site by getting a diesel generator on, or potentially even some solar. You could if that meant that the site could be reclassified down out of from a large site, then you fall below the demand charges, which would make a difference to those sites. And I've already covered shifting the demand to daytime. Obviously, the more that you can offset your grid with your cheaper solar, the much better the metrics. So the case study growers are happy to answer some questions. We spent a lot of time with them collecting information and running through the various results. Both of them are looking very seriously at installing the solar, definitely. And we also used Craig Brooks from Gem Energy, who is happy to take calls. He's an expert in the area, and we found his engineering expertise very helpful when we were looking at the site specifics, and he basically knows lots of this off the top of his head and would be a useful contact for you. So there's some phone numbers for you as well if you'd like to speak to any of the growers or a solar expert.
Thank you, Janine.
So that basically wraps up.
Sorry, you go.
I was going to say that wraps up the presentation, and if anyone wants to type some questions in, go ahead on the right-hand side of the bar. Feel free to type any question at all. We're happy to take questions from the audience.
So just while people are thinking, we certainly have discussed, Janine and I both, where the battery situation is heading. The engineers and providers tell us that there are more entrants coming into particularly the lithium-ion battery market, and that's driving prices down already. Servicing regional centres, lithium-ion is quite expensive at the moment. We have modelled that at around $800 per kilowatt hour, which is, it's cheaper to back up with a diesel genset rather than put a battery in that's going to last 10 years and then you have to replace it, or the warranty only goes 10 years. So the warranties are extending as well. So look, that's a really interesting space. We feel that much of the work we're doing in our first year, the way technology is changing, could well be superseded in year 2 and year 3, which will certainly be interesting as we embark on the next round of information gathering and case studies, the way the battery market is heading and what the market's telling us that's happening globally with batteries. So there is a question in the question bar there. I'll just read that out. One second. Just expanding my question bar. Here we go. When residential solar took off, householders were told they needed to rethink how they use their electricity. Shouldn't irrigators rethink the rest of their system? High energy or low efficiency systems need to be addressed before looking at renewables. That's a really pertinent question. I guess renewable installation is only one of 3 ways to reduce your cost of energy. The other 2 are basically look at reducing your energy demand by improving your irrigation application efficiency and storage efficiencies, such as leaking channels, water storage, increasing the height of your earthen walls, or splitting that earthen storage into cells, for example. And the other way is obviously looking at your current pumping system. There may be inefficiencies with the pump motors or the configurations of the pipes, which could be adding friction and head to your system. So yes, that's a good question and a good comment. Installing renewables is only one of 3 ways, and probably to be fair, that the installation of renewables is probably best designed or most applied to those irrigators that have done everything they can with their pumps to make them efficient as they can be, and their irrigation setups are as efficient as they can be on a water sense. So yeah, this is only one of 3 alternatives available to irrigators to cut their costs. Here we go. We do have another question there. What about PV over time?
I can jump in and answer that question. So we did look at the degradation of the PV panels. So basically over at about the 25, they're at 85% efficiency. So starting off at 100 in year 0 to 1 and down to 85% efficiency in 25, which is generally the norm on how you'd analyse it, but also considered conservative. So yes, we did. We looked at the solar and the resource over time.
Okay, the next question there, did you evaluate any scenarios with batteries or storage, for example, seasonal irrigators that might not gain the benefit of their investment throughout the year? Absolutely. Batteries were certainly part of the optimisation process, and at the moment the costs just don't quite stack up. Batteries are currently the best economic fit for them at the moment is in schools and hospitals, whereby those tariffs can be reclassified from demand tariffs back under the 100 megawatt per annum threshold, taking those schools and hospitals under that fixed tariff scenario into a more variable tariff scenario. But as for irrigators that normally have really intensive use for short periods and then a long season with no use, it doesn't stack up. The gen sets are coming in cheaper with a variable cost of sort of 24-25 cents per kilowatt hour to generate electrons. So the batteries, as the warranties extend and the quality and the cost comes down, we do see that as part of the mix. You know, it could be this time next year where we're seeing batteries come in potentially at $500 or $600 per kilowatt hour, but at 800, they certainly really haven't been that close just yet. So yeah, watch this space. Any other questions you can see there, Janine? If you have a large site, will Ergon just let you feed in the 39 of those kilowatts to make sure you get a tariff? If you've got a transformer, if you have a large site, can you just export 39 of those 100 kilowatts? Definitely not. It has to be all or nothing. You have to be 39 kilowatts of PV, or but you can apply through a license. There can be you can go through the studies and potentially get the 30 kilowatts of export, but that is a case-by-case basis. But the general rule of thumb at this stage, the providers are telling us that you really have to stay under the within the export limits to make sure that you can export. But well, I probably shouldn't have been so firm in definitely not, but it does become discretionary to work on. Michael, hopefully that answers your question. No other questions there we can see.
I'll just add in a little bit more on a couple of those last questions. So for those with the larger sites, depending how large they are, but the addition of a microgrid and a potential to bring the grid demand down under the 100 megawatts per annum, that really could be a key savings in terms of just the tariffs then that become available to you if you're reclassified and moving away from those demand tariffs. So that is definitely something to look at, and many of the solar resellers will provide analysis to you. Finding one you can trust, like we found Gem Energy, and think they are quite transparent in their analysis and can show you potentially how a reclassification could work for you. Also, in terms of the batteries or storage, one of the John may have said this, my internet dropped out for a minute there, but one of the benefits of a microgrid is the numbers certainly stack up for the solar now to offset some of your daytime usage. And a microgrid can be a bit bolt-on. You might run with some solar now, so to start getting the benefit of that now, to make the most of the STCs, those small certificates, to offset the capital costs. And in 18 months, 2 years, 5 years even, battery pricing comes down, you might look at adding in some storage then. So it really can be added on to when the economics stack up.
Well, it looks like we've answered all the questions, Janine. At the conclusion of this webinar, there will be a survey go out just for our own internal reporting and purposes of the usefulness of the webinar to you and how we can better improve this communication in the future, and also a link to a short YouTube we have done in another irrigated sector, in irrigated cotton. So if you could please take 1 or 2 minutes post this webinar to fill that out, that'd be much appreciated. But other than that, we might end the recording now, and hopefully we can do this again in 12 months or so when we have some more results online, and good luck for the upcoming cane season. Janine? Okay, there, Janine?